Hello and welcome to today's lecture. Today we'll be talking about genetic differences. My name is Kendra Gagnon. I'm a pediatric physical therapist and a professor of physical therapy. When you complete today's session, you should be able to describe how genetic syndromes are identified, identify common impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions associated with genetic syndromes such as Down syndrome, and describe acquisition of motor skills for children with genetic differences such as Down syndrome. So before we dive into discussion of genetic differences, just a really quick genetic review. So remember, we all have 23 pair of chromosomes, 22 pair are autosomes, one pair are your sex chromosomes, so your XY. So if you are XY, you're male. If you're XX, you're female. Chromosomes are composed of DNA, and a gene is a length of DNA that codes for a specific protein. And there are approximately 30,000 human genes, and we're learning lots and lots about genomics. As we speak, it's an exploding area of study. So when we think about our different pairs of chromosomes, there are, and really all of the DNA and genes that we have, there are really enormous possibility for something to duplicate or be missing. And so for something to sort of go wrong when we're developing. And so chromosomal disorders occur in about 1 in every 160 live births. It's the leading cause of pregnancy loss. So we know that about 1 in every 160 live births is a child with a chromosomal disorder. But we also know that a huge number of miscarriages and pregnancy losses are because of chromosomal disorders. So it's hard to know exactly. It's kind of hard to exactly get that data, but we know that chromosomal disorders account for at least half, probably more, of first trimester miscarriages and 20% of second trimester miscarriages. So when we talk about 1 in every 160 live births as an embryo or fetus, or excuse me, a baby with a chromosomal disorder, we also know that there's also a large number of embryos and fetuses who have chromosomal disorders that do not end in live birth. And these can be deletions, so a chromosome that's missing, duplication, so an extra chromosome, or translocation, where chromosomes or pieces of chromosome are sort of switch places. So one of the most common chromosomal differences is Down syndrome, which is also known as trisomy 21. So Down syndrome is a duplication. Individuals with Down syndrome have an extra chromosome. And it's just a note, across the different chromosomal abnormalities in general, it's better to have a duplication or extra chromosome or extra DNA or genes versus having a deletion. Oftentimes, the deletions are the ones who end up not experiencing live births or very short lives, because if a chromosome is missing, often it has a really important function in our body. And so it's oftentimes that that missing chromosome is just really not compatible with life. And so oftentimes the genetic conditions we see tend to be trisomies, duplications, extra pieces of genetic material. And so Down syndrome is an extra 21st chromosome. And so you can see kind of a genetic panel here. And when we get down to 21, you can see instead of there being 2 chromosomes, there's 3. And so you can see here's a couple of individuals here with Down syndrome, an infant and a young man here. So some common impairments that we see in Down syndrome, first of all, there are some different kind of features and structural differences in the bodies of people with Down syndrome. You can see this little girl here. Oftentimes there's what we call epicanthal folds around the eyes, small mouth, large tongue. You can see sometimes there's kind of a really high forehead, a wide nasal bridge, short in stature, short limbs. Sometimes we even see sort of webbing between toes and fingers. So there's oftentimes that can be kind of the first indication that a newborn infant has Down syndrome if they aren't diagnosed prenatally, is looking at those kind of facial and body differences. But really, from a physical therapy perspective, the biggest thing that we see in children with Down syndrome is that low tone. So children with Down syndrome tend to have very low tone, very floppy, very hypermobile joints, um, very lots of weaknesses. They're going to tend to walk with flat feet, with kind of real pronated, because they're just not a lot of muscle tone and strength there. Diastasis recti is also commonly seen in Down syndrome. Something that's important for us to understand is that atlantoaxial instability is seen in about, I believe, about 12% of children with Down syndrome. And so that's something that we have to be aware of. What we want is most children with Down syndrome will have an x-ray by the age of 2 or so that will take a look at those structures and make sure that they don't have that atlantoaxial instability. But in the meantime, we want to be careful about doing activities like somersaults. And certainly if we know that child has atlantoaxial instability, we want to avoid that. Microcephaly, mild microcephaly, individuals with Down syndrome do have smaller brains, and so smaller heads as well. Intellectual disability is almost always part of Down syndrome. Talked about hypotonia, and then this results in just developmental delay. And so again, oftentimes we're seeing children with Down syndrome to kind of help provide, to help with some strengthening, to help do some developmental exercises, to get them going through the developmental sequence, and to look at things like, is the low tone impacting their foot and ankle position? Do we need to do some orthotics to give them some stability so that they can begin walking? And this chart kind of gives you a sense of motor milestone acquisition in Down syndrome. And I don't necessarily expect that you would memorize this chart, but I do think it's worth noting that children with Down syndrome, on average, do reach their motor milestones later, but they do reach them. And so, again, as physical therapists, unless there's something else going on, we're just kind of there to help support them, maybe help kind of nudge them along, and then to provide support to make sure that they don't learn kind of bad movement habits or experience a lot of instability that could lead eventually to secondary impairments. You can see here, children with Down syndrome tend to stand and walk kind of around their second birthday. They tend to learn to sit around their first birthday. They tend to creep, maybe by the time they're 1.5. And so, as a rule of thumb, and again, just like with typically developing children, there's a wide range of motor development in children with Down syndrome, but this just shows you averages. But as a general rule of thumb, you can kind of expect it to take children with Down syndrome about twice as long as their typically developing peers to reach motor milestones. So again, that really presents an opportunity for intervention for us, because if we think about all of the kind of social mobility and other aspects of development, cognitive, social, emotional, that happen with movement, that extra time can have a really large impact on a lot of areas of development. So we're really getting in there to try to help nudge them along, to get them going, to help provide them with opportunities for movement and mobility. That ends our session for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.